There are three main things about a smartphone that will define how you shoot with it. There are size and weight, sensor size, and lenses. Hey everyone, it's Steven here for another session of our Sundance Collab mobile filmmaking course presented by Xiaomi. Now we have most of the basics of shooting on a smartphone under us, it's time to go on to the specific shooting techniques with a phone. As you can see, shooting on a phone versus shooting on a professional camera are very different in terms of size and weight, but we're not going to go into comparing the difference between the quality of color space, etc. in mobile phones and professional cinema cameras. What we want to show you today are some of the aspects of mobile filmmaking and how you can take these parameters of filmmaking on a phone that we talked about in previous lessons and use them to your advantage. There are three main things about a smartphone that will define how you shoot with it. There are size and weight, sensor size, and lenses. First, let's start with size. The size of the phone will obviously dictate the shoot, especially with camera movements. For example, because the phones are so small and light, normal whips, pans, and camera movements are generally exaggerated, so you will need plenty of experience practicing and adjusting your movements with the camera. One big example of this is vertical movement. This is something that most people might not realize about phones, but because they are so light, vertical movement, or the movement up and down, is picked up a lot more when you're shooting on a phone. Even when using a gimbal, this can be noticeable. The way to get around this is to either adjust your movements to counteract this, or this might be counterintuitive, add more weight to the phone or the stabilizer that you are using to get the result that you are looking for. The next factor to consider is sensor size. Most of you might be used to working with large sensors, but phones normally tend to have much smaller sensors than cinema cameras, although we are catching up. Because the sensors are smaller and the lenses are so compact and so close to the sensor, this actually creates a really shallow depth of field. This might seem counterintuitive to many filmmakers, but that's something you need to take into advantage when you are shooting with a phone. The shallow depth of field and the very short focusing distances can allow close-ups and macro shots to look very cinematic on a phone. This works especially well when there is a small subject in the foreground and a distant background. It is astonishing how much bokeh and background blur you can get on these phones. These kinds of shots will take your mobile filmmaking to another level. The last point I want to talk to you about is framing. Obviously, phones are limited by the hardware that they have on them, so there's a few ways we can get about this. Before we get into that, I want to point out one thing. No matter how many lenses your phone has, and I will show you, if your phone has one lens or 5 lenses, whatever how many lenses it has, there is normally one lens that either produces the best quality or has the most filmmaking options. This is normally the main lens on a phone. We recommend sticking to this one lens and readjusting your framing around this lens rather than using all of the lenses. Of course, you can use the others, but you might see a dip in quality between lenses, which is something to keep in mind. There's two ways that we can get around this. One is by sticking to the wide lens, or the best lens, and adjusting all of the framing around this, or two, using additional lenses that we will speak about in the next lesson. Additional lenses can be great, especially for getting certain looks like fisheye or cinematic compression, but a lot of times you will be amazed by just how versatile the main lens can be on your phone. It's all about trying it out and seeing what works best for you. And now it's time to call my good friend and Xiaomi creator Luis in the US to see what he thinks about what we just talked about. Stay tuned. So to show all of these elements in play, I'm going to chat with one of our Xiaomi creators, Luis Guanzon. Luis is a filmmaker based out in Baltimore, Maryland, and has been creating commercial films and other projects for over 10 years. He has also been shooting on phones for years, and he is an expert in this field. So Luis, my first question for you is, what are some tips and tricks that you can recommend to everyone so that they can get the most cinematic look possible?
I think these days the phrase cinematic look kind of has a different meaning to different people. A lot of people starting out jump straight to, color correction or camera movement. And while those elements, most certainly contribute to, a more cinematic look, I think there are definitely some basics that people forget to consider. Personally, I think of cinema or, a cinematic image, at its core is an image that effectively conveys a very specific idea, a very specific mood, very specific subject, a very specific vision. Now, obviously, the vision of your film is overarching and will develop over the course of your entire film. But, on a more macro scale, I think each individual frame of your film tells a smaller story that in turn contributes to the entire story. So being mindful of each frame has such a big impact exactly what you're trying to say. I do come from a photography background, and I approach photography as an art form that is exclusive, meaning I try to exclude everything I can from a frame that, detracts from my subject or, the story I'm trying to tell, which is very important in photography because you literally only have one frame to tell your story. So, with a cell phone where your main sensor is usually tied to a wide lens, the main sensor meaning the highest quality sensor, I think where it becomes difficult there is, you try to exclude things and, all you have is a wide lens. So you have to get creative with, how you take things out of your frame that detract from your story. So that's where I like to use, exposure creatively to help me create that more cinematic look. Like, does everything in your frame need to be exposed properly? Everything in your scene need to be exposed, bang on? Are there foreground elements in your frame that you can underexpose to black? Can your subject be a silhouette and, still effectively, give the right mood or tell the right story? Does the sky need to be exposed properly? Can you blow it out? These are all questions you can ask yourself when you're thinking about the scene that's going to be unfolding in front of your camera. Another thing to consider when you're shooting with cell phones is the dynamic range typically isn't as wide as a traditional cinema camera. So again, making those decisions about exposure can help you in that department. You're not need to expose across an entire frame. If you're just focusing on certain elements of the frame and you can either blow out or underexpose elements you don't need, then you're leaving all that room for what you do want to see, for what's important to your story. So when you're not pushing the sensor that hard, it should actually give you a better file to color grade when you do get to that process. I think, to summarize, making creative decisions early on exactly what needs to be exposed properly or what can be framed out by either underexposing them or blowing them out, I think helps you get a more concise, focused image on a wide lens without having to completely just physically get closer to your subject. Because, on a wide lens, the closer you get to your subject, things start to look a little wonky. Once you get a good grasp of kind of approaching shooting your scene with a wide lens, because all you have is a wide lens, adding a little motivated, subtle camera movement, I think, those few tips and tricks can really help you seal the deal on achieving that cinematic look.
So my next question is, how do we take advantage of the phone's differences that we just talked about?
I think any great cinematographer will tell you that, experience and lots of practice is really what helps them hone their style in and, sharpen their skill set. I think the fact that you have your phone on you all the time, it enables you to just practice anywhere you are, on a bus, on the way to work, on the bus, on the way to school. Literally, there's stories unfolding all around us, during our daily routines. So, learning to see the world in a unique way is what sets apart filmmakers from great filmmakers. And having that filmmaking tool right in your pocket is a huge advantage. The fact that you have it with you anytime you want to record something, and you have the same device when you're going to shoot your film, it's a huge advantage. Like, getting to know how your phone reacts to different light, whether you're shooting at night, where you're shooting on the street with street lights, you're shooting at sunset, you're shooting, in a backlit situation. Like, we encounter these different types of lighting situations, all day long. So understanding how the camera on your phone reads and interprets these situations is like, having an experienced DP that knows the color science of, their favorite cinema camera. I think understanding your tools, parameters, and strengths and weaknesses can, help you improve your footage immensely. I think a more direct advantage of shooting on a phone is its physical size and ease of handling, especially on set. Like, if you're working with a crew or talent, it's so simple to just walk around with the phone in your hand and, give notes to your DP, give notes to the talent as you're, blocking them out. And, you can even record as you're shooting and you're walking through the set, hit record and then hand it over to the talent or hand it over to the DP so you can show them, exactly this is what's in my head. And again, the cool advantage of that is, that's actually the device you're shooting your film with. Another advantage of shooting with a cell phone is that, we can put the camera almost anywhere we want. Like, it's small enough, it's light enough, we can, fit it in nooks and crannies. We can, it's safer, you can hang it above, and it's safer, in terms of, just safety on set. It's not, a 50-pound camera that's hanging above your talent. It's, a camera that weighs less than a pound. So, rigging is going to be much easier. And, another, I think, advantage for me, shooting with a cell phone is, when I put the cell phone on the small gimbal, and I'm holding the camera, it really becomes kind of an extension of my arm. I forget it's there. It's comfortable. It's, I don't know, more organic, I guess.
So my next question is, did you ever feel like there was a time when you took advantage of the phone's sensor?
Obviously with mobile phones, we have smaller sensors. So I definitely think one of the advantages of having a smaller sensor is, when you're at that kind of medium to long, telephoto range and you're on a gimbal, your depth of field is much wider. So in terms of, following your subject, it's much more forgiving and you don't need pulling focus for you. You can kind of keep things, in focus and in control because of that smaller sensor, which gives you that wider depth of field when you're on a gimbal. So
I wanted to ask you, how do you approach framing and setting up shots differently on a smartphone?
I think framing is something that's independent of the medium you're shooting on, whether it's a cell phone, whether it's a cinema camera, whether it's a DSLR. I think what dictates framing is basically the scene that's unfolding in front of you. Like, if you're running gun, like, you got to pay attention to, what's happening, and your framing is always going to change. Something that might add a lot of time when you're working with a cinema camera or, even a DSLR, that, you need a tripod to kind of fix or find, where your frame at. With a cell phone, you can literally just walk around and move, stick and move, and see what works. So framing, I think, is independent of what you're shooting on, but the approach to framing on a cell phone, those decisions that you got to make because of the fact that you only have a wide lens, I think those are the things that you got to, pay extra attention to.
My last question is, how do you incorporate the different lenses into your filmmaking?
I do think that, macro lenses, when they're available, work great, as long as you have the available light and a way to stabilize the camera. And, same thing with telephoto lenses. I think, given the situation, as long as you have enough light and a way to stabilize, I think they could work. The easy thing with the cell phone is that you can literally just hit record and playback and see what it looks like. But again, for me, I think the biggest takeaway I've had just from shooting with cell phones for the last few years is I get the best results when I use the best sensor that's available.
And that's it for this Sundance Collab class. Thanks for Luis for joining us, and we'll see you guys soon.